as you can see, these people, when they're walking by the sidewalk, they encounter these signs. And one thing I like to throw out there is just this question: are you aware of any green developments that have implemented such an education program to engage residents? Because I've been all around and I'm still yet to find one other besides Madeira and Harmony in Florida that have done such engagement in terms of putting this up there. I should take that back. There's one in Illinois, Prairie Crossings, that's done somewhat of a good job in terms of engaging residents within a residential neighborhood. But I am always interested if people run across these examples. I'm compiling these examples. And so either send me an email or message me after this presentation. So, but how can government, city and county planners and staff and elected officials support conservation development initiatives that go beyond design and actually conserve biodiversity? And I think really when you think about those three phases, if there's any take-home message that I would like to report in for you to take home, is that we need more policy to address construction and post-construction. We have policy that addresses design, but we need to go beyond design and really address these other two phases. And what kind of policy will look for that? From our conversations with developers and built environment officials, that density bonuses are one way to entice and give incentives for developers to adopt more stewardship practices. You know, that's things about native landscaping, using environmental covenant codes and community codes and restrictions, having a biodiversity conservation and restoration management plan, having that signage within the neighborhood, and also I think funding mechanisms that you know, if you're going to do a prescribed burn 5 years after a development's been implemented in the natural areas, where's the funding going to come from? So you need to implement fiscally ways to do this, such as homeowner association dues or a special assessment on property taxes. But when we've looked at other incentive-based policies that look primarily at design, not much on the management scheme, we found through research that most of these the incentives fail. Most people don't take them up. But the ones that do have three ingredients. One is that it develop incentives with stakeholder input. And by the way, this is Prairie Crossings in Illinois with some native type of management where they do prairie type of landscaping in the common areas. But without stakeholder input, many of the incentives may not really be incentives by local, viewed by local built environment professionals. So you need that input. Secondly, you need a good marketing and education campaign because the inertia of conventional development is really strong. People have done this way for the past 40 or 50 years. Why should we change? And so it really takes a lot of marketing and education to get people to change their current ways. And thirdly, I think you need to you need government capacity, and that all departments are engaged. And what do I mean by this? Well, when we first tried to implement some of these alternative low-impact development practices, such as dealing with stormwater, with rain gardens, swales, no curb and gutter, there's a lot of resistance by civil engineers because on the books they understand that you curb, gutter, and shunt water into this area. Well, that curb and gutter approach for water quality is utterly, well, mainly failed. And so going to a more distributed type of system, you have to have the engineers on board. So you can't just implement through planning a policy that rewards developers that do rain gardens and swales and or curb and gutter, because when they submit that plan and then it runs up against the barrier of the engineering, the regulators, it can throw a wrench into any incentive-based policy. And we have got burned on that just through experience where we thought all our ducks on a row, and then there was one or two engineers that wouldn't go along with it and actually delayed the development. And you can imagine what the developer thought of that incentive-based policy once that development was delayed. But how can built environment professionals, this is everything from environmental consultants, landscape architects, developers, landowners, help to conserve biodiversity? And I am utterly convinced that the main way to go is to build model developments. If we had a model community that people can see, touch, interact with the people or the developer that's done that community, it goes a very long way to pushing the bar a little higher in terms of what a sustainable development is. And the examples I have in Florida are Harmony Madeira. There's the Woodlands at Davidson in North Carolina is another one. And in fact, if you're interested in certification in terms of what certifications, I would say really rank biodiversity up there with other issues such as energy, water, livability, and transportation. There's this wildlife-friendly certification in North Carolina that I would think the bar is much higher than any of LEED or any local certifications. To learn more about these communities, these model developments, there's that website there that has those online. And then once we have these model developments, then order tours and so people can see the local examples with their own eyes. I mean, one thing as an ecologist over the years working with built environment professionals is it's the same even for an ecologist. We want to see it. We want the proof. Proof is not in the presentation or the paper. It's really actually seen on the ground. But I've left out many of the details on how to create these conservation developments. I mean, everything in the design phase, from the construction phase, and the post-construction phase. And there are several online courses that go into these details, and you get a 126-page resource manual that addresses this. There's one website there that will give an approved, accredited course. There's also, if you like, there's the Green Leap book. It's just called the Green Leap, and it gives many examples and model communities they can refer to about what type of practices were used to conserve biodiversity. So this course is divided into 4 sections. One is about key concepts and players. Why to conserve it, what are the financial strategies for conservation, examples of sustainable development projects and policies. And then section 2 is really about how do we do it. I mean, what do we need to do during the design phase in terms of prioritizing areas to be conserved, what does it mean to be wildlife friendly in terms of transportation networks, and how do we juxtapose the vertical structure, the built structure, and the horizontal structure. And then a construction phase. I talked a little bit about that, but I think it's really about having engaged contractors and managing earthwork machines. And then also post-construction, how do we engage residents? What are some of the tactics to do this? How do we minimize human and wildlife conflicts and secure permanent funding for management over the long term, way after the developers left? So in summary, I think conservation development must address decisions by the citizens, developers, and policymakers. We can't just focus on one of these groups. And then when we do a development, design is not enough. That's only the first step. It's an important step, but it's only the first step. We need to address construction and post-construction phases. And again, there's that continuing education course. You can register at gbrionline.org. And if you want to learn more about PREC, that's our URL address, and that's my email address. And for those that stuck around for the snafu with the internet, I'm happy to take any questions. I'm not sure, Vivian, if there has been any sense of
Yes, this is Vivian. We do have
of internet connection, but I will end my presentation there.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mark, and apologize to everybody for the problems. We'll have to figure out what happened. It was something on our end, but most of you did hang in there, and we appreciate it. We do have a number of questions that have come in, but I would like to remind you, Mark, if you could maybe go to your next slide, that you have a control panel on your screen, and you can type in questions. So please type them in. Please try to keep them somewhat succinct if possible. But let me start asking Mark the questions that we have already. The first question, Mark, is, in your opinion, what is the most beneficial post-construction step that an individual property owner can easily do to increase biodiversity within their community?
The most important. It depends on the community. If you're talking about a centralized urban community versus a green, let's say a brownfield versus a greenfield, it's all really about engagement of the residents. So it might be a little different for a brownfield, like inside an urban center, versus a greenfield maybe on the ex-urban area. But I think it is really about engaging people that move into that community. And how do you do that? Well, I think passively you do that with a signage program, with a website, with trained realtors. I remember going to a green development, sending my graduate student down there just to ask questions with the realtor taking around showing the homes. They had no idea about any of the energy efficient features of a home or the landscaping or the natural areas. I think it's really getting the norm of the community about conservation. You have to do that from the very beginning. So we do attract, I mean, the one thing about these green developments, they don't attract like green-minded people. They attract people due to price point and location and all the other reasons. They happen to like the open space, but they don't really understand what that open space is for. So I think some type of signage program is critical, but beyond that signage, I think we need a management kitty. You can't just leave it up there for the natural areas to manage themselves. They need some funding mechanism, whether it's through homeowner association dues or a special assessment on the tax on the properties that are levied. There's got to be some type of management funds to keep the project going beyond when the last home was sold.
Okay, this kind of relates to that question, but could you talk about the role of neighborhood associations in all of this?
Well, I think that's the norm of the community. So if the norm is turf grass in the front and the covenants say you have to manage turf grass, then the neighborhood associations are going to come down hard on anybody that puts natives. And you can remember some of the battles that have been going on, especially during the drought, when people were required by the homeowner association to water the yard, and the water management district was saying you can't water the yard. There has to be a neighborhood association that has covenants that are more environmental, that actually allow people to do native landscaping and to allow people to do more alternative practices. And then you got to have elected homeowner association, the board members, to be understanding with that. So I really think it's from the get-go. It comes from the developer when they set up everything that sets the norm for the community to do more sustainable type of practices.
Okay, this is a rather long statement/question, but I think it's an important one. It's from somebody who in 1992 was the principal planner for DRI in Hamilton County, and they say that the Game and Fish Commission approved a gopher tortoise management plan, including burning to manage the gopher tortoise preservation area. When he went back 10 years later, found that the tortoises were gone and nobody had enforced the plan. And he raises the issue that neither the rural counties, the regional planning councils, or the state seem to do any enforcement. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's, again, goes to policy. When we talk about these green developments, you've got to have all three stakeholders involved. I mean, like for that one example, people drop the ball. You need something in place from a policy standpoint that people can go back to have enforcement. And so I bet in this situation there wasn't any money to fund anybody to come back and check those natural areas. And so it just went to the wayside. Everything was set up with good intentions, but without follow-through, without funding. And for example, we're exploring here in Alachua County to give credit to more enhanced stormwater basins for open space credit, but we were going to have a funding mechanism that hires somebody locally to check these areas once a year. Is it going the way we originally thought? I think without that, you're going to find those examples where again, 10 years down the road, everything just falls apart. You need someone to annually check and see whether the original intention of the natural area that was conserved and supposedly managed is still keeping up to date.
Okay, we have another question. How can this concept fit within transit-oriented mixed-use compact developments? They say that a lot of your examples seem to be showing large residential subdivisions, and is there a role for these concepts in more compact urban developments?
I would say yes, unequivocally. The one thing didn't have time to go into is that every little bit counts, and so maybe in the transit-oriented, multimodal transportation types of communities, more densely packed, there might just be just a little bit of open space, not much. How does that all fit in? I think that one tree, that one majestic live oak, that one little bit of utility right-of-way that has native plants in it, it does impact positively for biodiversity. Now, you may not be able to have panther habitat or black bear habitat or even bobcat habitat, but there are tons of insects, plants that all can survive and thrive in small little remnant patches that are found in these transit-oriented type of communities that don't have as much open space. So yeah, don't assume, I don't want to give the impression that you have to do large greenfield type of residential communities. I think even in a downtown area there's opportunities to make impacts in terms of conserving native plants and animals.
Okay, we have another comment, I guess. It's saying that many folks don't understand biodiversity, but may understand the need to conserve water. What role do you think issues like that play in what you're talking about in terms of education?
I think there's so many connections between water, energy, walkability, biodiversity that we've used that all the time. Our foot in the door might have been a water issue. But you can imagine that water's connected to wildlife pretty directly and indirectly. Just to give you an example, efficient irrigation, if you have systems that are overwatering or putting in landscaping that requires a lot of water, then you're drawing down the water supply and nearby wetlands, and groundwater dries up. And so, the nice lake next door and the nice wetland next door is all drawn up because of the amount of watering that's going on in the landscaping. So when you do efficient type of water-efficient landscaping with water-efficient types of irrigation systems, or no irrigation, which I'm a proponent of, then you conserve the nearby wetlands. So definitely, there's lots of connections between, if you make a walkable community, well, walkable community means reducing the amount of vehicular traffic, which reduces the amount of roadkills, which in turn also gives some open space for people to walk around, and that can be designed and managed for wildlife as well.
Okay, this next question could probably be the topic of a webinar entirely on its own, but I'll put it out there. Presently, there is not the organizational capacity to change the way developers, engineers, and politicians think. What has to happen to begin this work in Florida? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It goes back to my example. We need that model community to be built. I've seen that all the talking and presentations in the world doesn't mean, well, I hate to say, yeah, here we are talking and giving a presentation, but until it translates into a local model community, that paves the way. I hate to use that word, pave, but that paves the way for kind of change in people's attitudes and practices. I've seen that with Madera, I've seen it with Harmony, I've seen it with Prairie Crossing, I've seen it with other green communities throughout the world, that maybe the bar, you can always criticize a green community. If you're coming from an energy perspective, there might not be the best energy practices, or from a biodiversity, it might not be the best biodiversity practice. But they've done a little bit more, and it just raises the bar a little bit to have people see something different. So if there's anything that I would be a proponent of, is to find that one landowner developer, that one perhaps planner that's willing to allow something different, and just get something built.
There was a question about Harmony and Madeira. Are they in a capacity to be the models you're talking about at present?
I would say it raises the bar. If I was to rank green communities from 1 to 10, I've never seen anything above a 5. That's my ranking. So I would say they're 4s, 5s. You know, they've done some good things. They haven't done everything good, but they definitely raised the bar more than I've seen other communities have raised the bar.
Okay. This question relates to management and permitting. Do you have any examples of good government capacity in implementing long-term requirements of these subdivisions?
Unfortunately, no. That's the one thing that I've looked everywhere for, and there hasn't been. I've seen things on paper, but in practice I have not seen things really managed in a way that's promoting biodiversity, because typically, like that one question or one example of the gopher tortoise, it looks good on paper, and everyone holds it up but then if you track it over years, it just falls apart. And I think the critical thing is you need a funding mechanism and oversight by the city and council and city and county that has someone that goes out there and checks it year to year. That's the only way it's ever going to work. Well, there might be other ways, but that's the one way I would say it's going to work. But unfortunately, there's not really a good example.
Okay. Are you aware of any economic models that can be used to encourage land developers to undertake green development because the profit margins are larger?
Yes, when you say model, more examples. So there's several studies out there that show that you get more per square foot, and the resale value is higher, and the homes sell faster in these green communities. You can search those through the scientific literature. If you buy my book, The Green Leap, there's all those examples in there as well. But I think it's really about the inertia. So even when you show a developer you get $5 or $10 more per square foot, they still are reluctant to change because they're so, all their consultants are so used to the engineered type of scrape everything, put it into blocks, and build up from there. So it takes that maverick within the community to do something different to get the ball rolling. Even if you show them studies that your community is going to sell better, it's going to sell more, and you pay less for landscaping. Even when you show those studies to a local developer, they're not. I would say they're not going to try it unless they see someone else do it.
Mark, this is Charles. I had a quick question related to that. To me, the other key player in a lot of this are the bankers that finance the developers' projects. Is there any outreach work to educate the financial community on some of these advantages?
Well, Fannie Mae, had some interest breaks for homeowners that did energy-efficient homes. So there are a few inroads on the energy efficient types of homes where they get a little break in their points, or I can't remember if they were points or their mortgage if they did an energy efficient home. But in terms of biodiversity, I haven't seen that. There's not on the homeowner level, there's not anything that gets rewarded in terms of financially through the banks. Now, do the banks look at green communities a little with a different lens and give the developer perhaps a better deal? There is, not yet, but there's this trend that people are looking at. Well, how? Not only in terms of how the homes are built, but how the community functions over the long term. Pays dividends. And so I could see, not now, but in the future, that perhaps getting through the permitting process, maybe instead of fighting the permitting process, banks will start looking at communities that actually pay attention to the permitting process and get through the whole permitting procedure in an easier way. I'm just rhetorically responding here because I could see that if a developer could show a bank that, hey, I am not only paying attention to some of the green practices that my county is trying to regulate, but also going past that distance, so I think I'm going to get through the permitting process even easier. I could see banks saying, hey, let's fund that individual versus this one over here that has a history of just fighting the whole way and delaying things.
We had a couple of administrative questions, so let me just answer those briefly. Somebody wanted to know if your slides are available, and if you look on the screen in front of you, the PowerPoint is available at 1000friendsofflorida.org. On the right-hand side, there's a What's New scrolling panel, and then there's a biodiversity webinar, and you can link to the PowerPoint there. We had a question, haven't some native species adapted to the changing environment, like eagles nesting in tall buildings?
Well, the peregrine falcon, I think, is probably more nesting in tall buildings. So yeah, there's certain animals, you know, we're not going to have any problems with raccoons in urban areas in terms of keeping them around. In fact, we have more nuisance problem in terms of with raccoons, and so it's all about managing your own yards and garbage and pets, etc., with raccoons in the area. So yeah, there's some species that do quite well in urban areas. Someone mentioned peregrine falcons that have adapted to nesting in buildings, and you could think of the rock dove or the pigeon that does well on buildings. So yeah, those species. But we're talking not only keeping the common species common, but also kind of threatened and endangered species in and around cities.
This is another question. What is going on lately in Florida with the idea of mapping environmentally valuable lands to form a green print as a region, then building around it?
I think there's several collaborative efforts that are out there, but I think those need to pay attention to what's around there, because again, I think what happens is that we put in the corridors, we put in these mapping, and then we just say, oh, let's build around it. Anything else we can build around it, and then we forget about the management of those built areas. So you have a nice corridor that's going between patch A and patch B, surrounded completely by urban areas that have planted invasive exotics and have feral cat colonies and have irrigation and fertilization practices that just destroy that corridor. So the one thing I would recommend is let's get beyond the design. I mean, the mapping, sure, is great. It's fine to find the best places to conserve, but then let's step outside of that and think about what's surrounding it, what's coming up next to these areas, and let's see how we need to manage those.
Okay, this is a rather long statement. Somebody said there are some subdivisions in New York that were required to comply with post-construction regulations stipulating prohibition on use of all but organic fertilizers. Also, some approvals are granted subject to compliance with 5-year monitoring plans that examine health and species diversity of implemented mitigation plans and specifies what must be done if certain standards have not been met. I didn't know if that was something you were aware of and wanted to discuss about, or if that's something to do more looking into.
Yeah, well, someone sent, I have been aware of, I mean, not sure where in New York, but someone just sent me a link or something about that. Yeah, I'll be happy to look at that.
Okay, we had a question about PREC, I think is how you call it. They wanted to know what kinds of technical assistance you offer and what the cost is for that.
Yeah, we're not PREC. Anyway, so PREC, it's on a site-by-site and case-by-case basis. So typically it's, well, I hate to discuss prices here. Let's just say we're much cheaper than typical environmental consultants. And so it just depends. And so it might be a day workshop, it might be a full site review, it might be looking at codes and policies and doing a review of that. So it's just, the best thing to do is just send me an email and send me the situation, and we can continue the discussion.
Somebody asked for your thoughts on Seaside Rosemary Beach and watercolor in Walton County.
Oh, honestly, I would say that would, well, I'm going to have to back up here. Probably in the 60s when Seaside, it was novel, but in terms of biodiversity, I think I don't think the people are engaged at all within those communities. I think, again, they really focus on design, spend all this time on looking at natural areas, well, not Seaside, but watercolors, and they've tried to implement some things, so I think they've raised the bar a little, but compared to what they could have done and how they could have managed things and whether really truly are a community that's focused on natural resource conservation, I'd say they're not that good.
Okay. We are coming to the end of the questions, so if anybody has any more, I'd encourage them to send them now. We do have one for a little bit of discussion on covenants, the pros and cons of covenants in terms of these types of projects.
What is the question? What are the pros and cons?
Yeah, well, it talks a little bit about how, you know, there can be covenants require maintenance of lawn, but during the drought it might be illegal to water enough to keep the lawns green. Just kind of a discussion of those types of issues.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I think most of the covenants don't address natural resource conservation. It's more about aesthetics and perhaps safety and other things like that. And I think what we need is more of a discussion and covenants that address natural resource conservation. So it will allow people, for example, to have a native lawn or a native yard or native landscaping as opposed to ornamentals and turf grass. And I think most of the ones I've seen look at maintaining turf and maintaining exotics versus the other way around. So we need those examples of those covenants that, you know, now again, how often are these covenants actually regulated? Well, it depends on how old the community is and the activity of the board, etc. But we do have an example of environmental covenants that are, if you go to the Harmony, well, if you go to the University of Florida, EDIS, it's EDIS. These are all fact sheets and reports that are available to the public, and you type in Harmony covenants, you can see an example of language. And I would say even that one, that was done 10 years ago, and I wouldn't say it's far enough. It's more just kind of, I don't want to say fluff, but it doesn't have actually strict repercussions for people that do go off target.
Okay, we've had a few more questions come in. How can agriculture provide a transitional area between urban biodiversity and the natural area?
How can agriculture? Well, I think if you look at the different land uses, I mean, agriculture is used by wildlife, depending on how it's managed. And so there's a lot of, that's a whole other presentation, there's a lot of sustainable agricultural practices that can provide cover, food, refugia for wildlife. I mean, I'd much rather have agriculture than build up urban in terms of wildlife habitat. So there are lots of opportunities, and I think lots of landowners just changing their practices or allowing more natural remnants and diversity to come up can really impact wildlife habitat.
Mark, this is Charles again. Quick question. How do you see local governments sequencing the next conservation subdivision? I always have the impression that it's difficult to try to link, you know, open space with the next project or the project after that. Do you see local governments that have solved that problem?
Yeah, that's kind of the bigger picture. So, you know, fine if you have a planning that everyone has to conserve 40% within some overlay. But if that's not connected at all, then you just have a bunch of little dots that are separated, and you get a fragmented type of area. So you got to think beyond the different properties, and that's been a tougher nut to crack, because I think a lot of times what's implemented is just, again, kind of this focus on site by site, but then they don't think about the connections between the site. Or, for example, if you have to do 40% conservation of open space, then you should require developers to look within a 2-mile radius and see where the nearest natural remnant is or potential for corridor, and that's where you would put your 40%. So no, there's not really, I think really probably there's some examples in Oregon that do this. They have, and Washington, they have some regional plans, but how well they're actually implemented, I have to say that, well, during the recession, it has been kind of a standstill, but as things pick up, we'll see how those actually get implemented.
Okay, we have one final question. By 2060, climate change and sea level rise will greatly affect natural habitats in urban areas. Have you considered methods to address this?
Yeah, so mitigation adaptation for climate change, and particularly a coastal state such as Florida. That's, what do we talk about? Retreat? Do we talk about areas that were, for example, if you're in North Florida near St. Augustine, you do have some beach dune systems left, but what happens when that just totally gets flooded out? Then I would think all those little urban natural areas do become more important because they become refugia for critters that have to retreat away from the dune system. Now, how that will translate, that's going to be difficult, but I think suffice to say that those urban areas that do have more natural or managed remnants that promote habitat, then they will fend better for species in the region that don't have that. Because once those coastal areas are gone, there's nothing to retreat to, then you're just going to have species extirpated from that region.
Mark, one last question from me. How do you reconcile, or how do you integrate mosquito spraying, since that's such a big thing in Florida, with biodiversity protection?
Again, it's going to be dependent on the area. I mean, you can think of the water management districts that do water level type of management, but you're probably referring to individual cities in Gainesville that do spraying. I think it's really about where and how they manage this. So, for example, aerial spraying for mosquitoes, if it's done during the day, you're going to impact the whole bee fauna. I mean, the bees are going to be heavily impacted and other types of pollinators. But if you do it strictly at night, you reduce that risk. And so there are ways to manage it to minimize impacts. And, there's health reasons for these aerial sprayings. But in reality, I mean, I'm not a token entomologist, and I don't deal with risk management for health questions such as mosquito vectors, etc. But I think it's more about the management around the home with open water, gutters that have standing water, than the aerial spraying itself.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark. We really appreciate your presentation, and thank you again to everybody who held on through our technical problems. We are attempting to broadcast this, and if that works out, we will be posting it in the next few days. We do encourage you to come back next month for our next webinar and sign up for email alerts with 1000 Friends of Florida. And again, thank you very much, Mark, for a really outstanding, informative presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Vivian. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.